The situation between the 17th and 18th centuries saw the need to supply the parishes with more priests to meet the growing demand of religious services among the native Filipinos. These and other factors eventually led to the birth of the Filipino secular clergy.
Ang larawan po kasi ng isang praile noon is yung trust, yung pagsunod sa isang parokya ay nasa kura paroko Kasi siya yung pinaka-visible na tao. Mas visible pa siya kaysa sa gobernador general, mas visible pa siya kaysa sa mga gobernador silyo kasi siya yung nandoon sa labas ng simbahan, inaral ang lengguwahe ng mga tao para makasalamuha sila. Kung ating titingnan, halos yung buong araw o buong buhay na ng mga Pilipino noon, umiikot na sa simbahan Kailangan nilang magumpisal araw-araw, kailangan nilang magsimba araw-araw. That was the minimum requirement during that time. At bawat pagtunog ng kampana ay nagsisignal ng isang religious activities, makulay at masaya. Plus sabi ko nga po, yung mga praile ay nandoon, nakahalubilo at kasama ng mga tao. Sa tingin ko po, yung in a manner of administration, hindi na apektuhan. But the need ng ibang magtayo ng ibang mga parokya sa ibang lugar, yun yung mas nangangailangan ng atensyon. So, kailangan i-restructure ito in a way na pagsasama-samahin mo itong mga barangay, bubuo ka ng tinatawag na town o pueblo, magtatayo ka ng simbahan, yun ang sentro ng pueblo, meron kang patio, meron kang parochial school, meron kang munisipyo, meron kang merkado. So, sa pagbubuo ng mga pueblo, mangangailangan ka ng mga workers, na mga pari. Pero yun ang gagaling sa kolonya ay hindi sumasapat doon sa mabilis na mission works and conversion of the natives. So, kinakailangan mo ng tulong ng tinatawag natin ng mga local clergy. It was an important period in our history wherein Filipinos who wanted to enter seminary were given a chance to pursue a priestly education and vocation. We have to understand during that time of Archbishop Santo Justa and of Governor General Simon de Anda, it was their desire. When we say it was their desire, nagkaroon ng malaking pagbabago sa Espanya noon, wherein the liberals were slowly gaining momentum in terms of policies being implemented in the colony. So it was simply a reaction from the Archbishop and Governor General to be true to what the liberals really wanted para sa kanilang mga kolonya. At siguro titinan ko ito doon sa, ito yung naging daan para sa mga Pilipino na pumasok sa seminaryo at makapag-aral.
According to the Concordat agreement with the Pope and the King of Spain, the natives can now be trained as priests and they can only join the secular order. 1698, the first known Filipino priest was ordained. And by 1760, there are only one out of 111 secular priests in the Diocese of Manila. 32 are Indios, 13 Chinese mestizos, and 6 are mestizos. So again, these are secular priests. So judging by their number, they're very few. And that's why there's a need to have a seminary for natives. So I allow the natives to become priests.
Yung mga pare na mga Kastila o mga pare na mixed race, kumbaga, yung desire nila ay wala doon. Nakita mo itong mga Pilipino na ito, gusto nilang maging pare. Actually, marami pong mga Pilipino no, who entered the seminary ang mga naging pari. So, I think bahagi doon sa reflection ni Archbishop ay matugunan yung pangangailangan ng kolonya. Ang setup po kasi noon, kung ating titingnan, halos kagaya ng setup na meron tayo dito. So meron tayong Archbishop at meron tayong mga dioceses. So dahil po karamihan ng mga parokya ay mga praile na napapabilang sa mga religious orders, Dominicans, Recollets, Agustinians, Jesuits. Technically, ang term na ginagamit ay they do not want to be under the bishop. Their feeling is their obedience ay doon sa kanilang superior from the religious orders. Actually, yun po ang isang pinagsimulan na conflict ng secularization issue. For the lack of better term, matigas ang ulo ng mga pari within the religious orders na nasa mga parokya. At ang isang function ng bishop is to do pastoral visits sa mga parishes. At ayaw ng mga praile ng ganoon. So, samantalang dahil nga nagkakaroon na ng desire at pangangailangan na magkaroon ng mga Pilipinong pari, at nakita nila na ang mga Pilipinong pari nito, they are more obedient to the bishop at hindi naman sila bahagi ng kahit na anong religious orders, so their obedience is to the bishop. At walang alam yung mga tao doon sa ano bang isyong nangyayari between the Filipino priest and the secular priest. That maintindihan po natin na this secular priest, they just wanted to have a part doon sa gawain ng simbahan to fit in to the missionary works of the church during that time. While the regular priest saw it as a competition, but for them, they just wanted to help doon sa proseso ng pananampalataya. Nang binuksan na ng mga seminary colleges ang kanilang pintuan para sa mga Filipinos who wanted to become a priest, nagkaroon na ngayon ng rift o tinatawag natin na rivalry between parish administration. Hindi pa tinatanggap ng mga Kastila, ng mga religious orders, ang mga Pilipino na nais na magpari. Merong mga considerations na dapat tingnan. Una, tingnan natin dyan yung purity of blood. Dapat na ang dugo mo ay purong dugo at walang halong tinatawag natin na halong dugong Pilipino, dugo ng mga Chinese, dugo ng mga Indians. So meron tayong tinatawag na limpeza de sangre factor doon sa kung sino lang ang po pwedeng pumasok sa seminaryo.
Limpieza de sangre, meaning to become a high-ranking member of the clergy, you must belong to all Christianity. Meaning, by the way, even among Spaniards, they have that. May discrimination na rin. Kasi among the Spaniards, there are three types. One would be a Spaniard who was a native of a province which was never conquered by the Muslims. You know, Spain was conquered by Muslims for 700 years. The second type would be a Spaniard who lived in an area that was conquered by Spain. So, ayun. The third, a Spaniard who descended from the Muslims, the Arabs. So, merong, siyempre, gusto nila siyempre yung pinaka-pure. And how much would that mean for an Indio? Hindi ka limpieza de sangre, kaya hindi ka pwede maging praile. You cannot become a Jesuit.
Pangalawa, kung sila ay tatanggap ng mga Pilipinong nais na magpari, ay napakabagal. Usually, nagkakaroon to ng interval ng every 4 years, tsaka lang sila tatanggap ng mga Pilipino na nais na pumasok sa seminaryo.
Bawal maging member ng regular orders ang mga Indio. Ayun ang kaso ni Hermano Pule. Gusto niya maging Dominicano pero tinanggihan siya dahil siya ay Indio. But again, you have native priests. Meron nga. Some of them were assigned to far-flung barrios. Bihira talaga ma-assign sa mga malaking simbahan.
Ayaw ng mga regular priest na magkaroon ng representation, yung tinatawag nating secular priest sa mga parokya. For several reasons. Number one, they are not fit to run a parish.
According to one document, the native priests were not as good as the Spanish ones. So, again, there's a racial implication here.
Number two, they are a secular priest, not a regular priest. So, in terms of status and equality, hindi sila magkapareho. At pangatlo, whether you agree with me or not, nagkaroon ng jealousy, pagseselosan, at eventually nagkaroon ng threat. The regular priest saw the secular priest as a threat to their position. Pero titingnan mo, hindi naman talaga yun ang issue. Ang issue ay may pangangailangan ang kolonya. And to address those needs, they should accept itong mga tinatawag natin na secular priest into the parish administration at pagpapatakbo ng mga parokya. Sa tingin ko po, ang isang pinakamalaking factor dito is that itong mga Pilipinong pari na ito is obedient to the bishop of a particular place. Actually, yun po ang isang mga dahilan ng pagkakaroon ng secularization issue na ito. Plus that, maintindihan natin na itong mga Pilipinong pari na ito, hindi naman talaga sila agad na naging kura paroko. Many of them became parochial vicars. Many of them were sent to educational institutions to teach. Many of them were sent to orphanages. Many of them were sent to hospitals to do other missionary works. So still part of the training of Filipino priest. Magandang tingnan din natin yung discussion ng secularization law noong taong 1813. Ano ang nilalaman nitong secularization law of 1813? Ilan sa mga provisions ng batas na ito ay una, yung mga tinatawag nating mission parish na mahigit 10 taon nang nasa pangangalaga ng mga regular priest ay dapat na ibalik na sa mga bishops ng naturang lugar. So, nung ibig sabihin nito, kung ibabalik mo na ang mga mission parish na ito sa pangangalaga at pamumuno ng mga obispo, mangangailangan ka ngayon ng tinatawag natin na secular priest. So, yung secularization law of 1813, tinitingnan ko ito bilang pagsisimula ng issue o conflict dun sa tinatawag nating secular Filipino priest and regular priest who belong to the religious orders. Bakit nagkaroon ng conflict? May mga kadahilanan. Una, ayaw sumunod nung tinatawag natin na regular priest doon sa pamamahala ng mga obispo. At kung ibabalik na ang mga mission parish na ito sa kontrol ng mga bishops, hindi naman papayag ang mga regular priest. So, mangangailangan ngayon tinatawag natin na secular priest para punuan yung mga mababakanting parokya na ito. Pangalawa, pangatlo doon sa provision ng secular law of 1813 ay pwedeng i-appoint ng bishop yung regular priest as an assistant or co-parish priest lamang at hindi sila doon sa status ng parish priest. At doon sa karakter ng mga regular priest, ayaw nila nito. They will not accept such status. So doon nabuo yung conflict na tinatawag nating secularization issue. So, during the time of Archbishop Basilio Santa Justa, and at the same time of Father Pedro Pelaez from Laguna, dito na nagkaroon ng mas malaking boses ang mga Filipino clergy.
He advocated secularization. And that's why he started to establish, turn out more native priests.
By the time 1877, naging vocal na si Archbishop Basilio Santa Justa na I will appoint Filipino clergy in the parishes. Sa aking assessment, naging napakabagal at naging napakatagal ng pagkakaroon ng mga Pilipinong pari para tumulong dito. At sa puntong ito, nagkaroon ng threat on the part of the regular priest, magre-resign kami if you are going to put Filipino clergy in the parishes. So, nagkaroon nga ng pag-pull out noong mga friars from the parishes. At ito ay naging providential para sa mga paring Pilipino. Yung mga nabakanting parokya ay pinunan ng mga Pilipinong pari. Notably, mga parokya sa Maynila at parokya sa Cavite. At the same time, naging malaking factor din yung expulsion of the Jesuits.
One has to understand the stupidity of this decision because so it happened in 1767. Okay, so the king then decided. It was kept secret. There were secret instructions about how to go about arresting the Jesuits and putting them in one place and then sending them off actually to Italy, to the Papal States, no? And here, please take note. At some point, the Pope in 1770 suppressed the whole Society of Jesus itself in the world, no? A papal suppression here to be distinguished from a royal suppression. Now, at around that time, the king, the time of the expulsion of the Jesuits, was Carlos III, as we would say, Charles III. No? So here we have to understand that Carlos III himself was, well, he would be known as the unenlightened despot. Okay? He was, of course, an absolute monarch, but it seems he wanted to introduce certain reforms, certain new things, etc. And the church personnel were identified as somehow against those reforms, okay? And some of them were identified as Jesuits. No? So from the Philippines, in my own readings, for example, there were supposed to be two reasons why the Jesuits were suspects. In 1762, well, from 1762 to 1764, the British actually occupied Manila and the environs, no? And therefore the Spanish officials basically then had to flee the capital city. No? Simon de Anda, I think, was the leader there. The acting governor general at the time was the Archbishop of Manila, Archbishop, got his name, Rojo, I think. In any case, the Jesuits, see, here's the thing. The Jesuits were asked to act as kind of couriers, no? Communication between the British officials in Manila and Simon de Anda outside of Manila, okay? Trying to get to talk and to negotiate or whatever. So after that whole thing was resolved, the Jesuits were accused of intelligencias, as it was called. No? Parang the Jesuits were accused basically of spying for the British, okay? That they were intelligence agents for the British, which is a crazy accusation. That's one. The second was that I think in the Holy Week celebrations in the Church of the Jesuits, no? I think it was Father Pazuengos, if I'm not mistaken, delivered a homily that was highly critical of the colonial government in Manila. So again, this thing about how the Jesuits were against, as it were enemies of the colonial state, etc., etc. Okay?
Malaking mga mission areas ng Jesuits ay nasa Mindanao. So kailangan mong punan ito. Ito ay pinunan ng mga secular priests at the same time ibinigay din sa mga Agustinian Recollets ang pamamahala na ito.
When this happened, the Recollects were given some parishes in Cavite. Also, the Dominicans were given some parishes in Cavite. Now, please take note, those parishes used to be run by the Jesuits. When the Jesuits were kicked out in 1768, those parishes, many of them, would then now be given over to the secular clergy, to the diocesan clergy of the Archdiocese of Manila. Okay? See, there was what we call the Patronato Real de la Iglesia de las Indias. The king was effectively the head of the colonial church. Okay? The head of the Spanish church, the head of the colonial churches. It was the king who appointed the bishops, for example. Okay? And the Governor General of the Philippines was the one who appointed parish priests, etc. Okay? So, this decision then made by the royal power, okay, and carried out in the Spanish colonies, you might say, basically it was you might say that the royal power shooting itself in the head. Why? Because it deprived, you might say, their colonies of the presence of the missionary religious order that was ministering to many thousands of people in the missions in Mindanao, in the Visayas, and in Luzon, and basically then uprooting them from their schools, which either had to close or had to be taken on by others, etc.
But there's another problem. The Spanish clergy started to complain that the priests were not well trained. Kulang daw sa training. Kaya, not as good as them. There may be an element of racism here. Ano bang level, what would be the parameter for well trained? They didn't say. The third is that the native priests sometimes had a problem of becoming vicious. Naging makasalanan. They become vicious.
There was an archbishop who came to the Philippines in 1768, Basilio Sancho de Santa Susta y Rufina. He was a piarist, as we would say, Escolapio. But he formed part of that circle around the king that kind of assured the king that what he was about to do, that is the expulsion of the Jesuits, was morally acceptable decision. There was nothing wrong with it morally, etc. So, because, well, the king was in fact the monarch, the head of the state, and he was an absolute monarch. So one of those people was in fact Basilio Sancho de Santa Susta y Rufina. And as a kind of actually recognizing his role in this committee, as it were, that assuaged the conscience of the king, he came to Manila and became the Archbishop of Manila. And he was an enemy of the Jesuits, and therefore also the regalist doctrine. As Archbishop, therefore, he had direct control over the diocesan clergy, but not over the religious clergy. So here in the Philippines, this problem will be exposed once again, the Archbishop against the Agustinians, the Archbishop against the Dominicans, etc. And then he would precisely try to take all the parishes and give them to diocesan clergy. But because there were very few diocesan clergy, Spanish diocesan clergy, he was the one who would accelerate, as it were, the number of native and mestizo priests. But, and this is Father Schumacher's thinking, and I think I agree with him, without giving these new recruits, as it were, the requisite formation and education they needed.
Actually, sa totoo po, if we might say half-cook ang formation ng mga Pilipinong pare. Dahil nga at the onset, ito lang kailangang matapos sila yung kanilang seminary formation, madalian, batay sa pangangailangan. Yung mass ordination, alam naman natin na ang bawat seminarista ay dumadaan sa mahabang proseso ng pag-aaral at formation, and then you have mass ordination just to fill in those needed spots sa iba't ibang mga parokya. But in time po, kahit naman po ang humawak sa mga parokya ay mga regular priest, ay mas in my analysis, mas naging madali ito para sa kanila kasi sila Pilipino, language barrier nawawala. At the same time, they know the culture, the practices, the ways ng mga tao. So eventually, mas naging effective ang administration. In time, natutunan ng mga Pilipinong pare ang magpalakad ng isang parokya. Bagamat mabagal yung development ng mga Pilipinong pare, pero over time, nakita yung sense of worth ng mga pare na ito. Kasi binigyan sila ng mga assignments, malalaking mga parokya ang ibinigay sa kanila. At mismo ang arsobispo ay bumuo ng tinatawag nating trust and confidence dito sa mga Filipino clergy na ito.
Let me provide a little background here as well. What was happening then at that time, please take note, the galleon trade would end, which was the main source of revenues for the Spanish colonial government and for many Spanish citizens in this country when it was under the Spaniards, as an effect of the French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte, the Latin American colonies of Spain would all win their independence one by one, so that at some point only Puerto Rico, Cuba, Philippines, Guam, etc. would remain. The turn of the century, from the 1700s to the 1800s, it was becoming clear to the Spanish colonial government that they could not continue to rely on the galleon trade for support, to finance their colonial operations here in the Philippines. That's why they started looking at the Philippines as a way to develop agriculture. And this is the reason why land would become more and more important in the Philippines. Abaca, for example, sugar, tobacco, all of that. The idea at some point was also to open up Mindanao. That's why we cannot separate Mindanao from our understanding of what happened to the Philippines. And because the Recollects were not in a position to try to advance their missionary work, because please take note, missionary work in itself was a valid reason for the Recollects and the Jesuits to be present in Mindanao. But of course, where the missionaries were, there were the Spanish colonial officials as well. And the idea was that Jesuits would be in a better position to kind of promote this opening up of Mindanao, the interior of Mindanao, do you understand? And therefore, bring back the Jesuits, because they will open up Mindanao to, for example, economic, agricultural production, etc. One thing also we have to understand at around this time, the demographics of the Philippines. I myself, I believe that when Magellan arrived in 1521, the population of the whole archipelago was probably about 500,000 people. And maybe by the end of the 16th century, the 1500s, maybe the population would be around 750,000 to 1 million. We do not have exact numbers here. We do not have exact figures. But we can kind of at least play with these figures, because when the Americans came and they had a census, I think in 1903, if I'm not mistaken, the population supposedly of the archipelago was somewhere 7-8 million. So, and the 19th century would in fact see a huge growth in population in the Philippines, because the economy was developing, agriculture was flourishing. The Philippines, Manila would be open to world trade as an effect in fact, kind of the British occupation of Manila, etc. Okay, and Cebu, Iloilo, several places in the Philippines would also prosper, etc. Okay, so so the Jesuits would return, and as I said, part of their mandate was now to take over the whole island of Mindanao. Okay? The Recollects then, instead of being given, let's say, missions in the Diocese of Haro had just been separated from the Diocese of Cebu, okay, and given missions. For example, the Marianas Islands was a huge mission area, mission territory. They were given parishes in Cavite, as I said, including the Dominicans. And there would be a series of cedulas, of decrees, ordering the diocesan clergy to give up those parishes. At some point, even the parishes that the diocesan secular clergy themselves had founded. You understand? Okay. So here is the thing: there is this huge injustice being perpetrated, okay, in the church, no, in the Philippines. No?
Bumalik sa 1859, pero ang masaklap, kami pinaalis. Wow naman, kaya kami na-transfer sa Manila. Ang order ng Reyna Isabela II to compensate the loss of Mindanao, binigay sa amin ng mga parokya sa Archdiocese of Manila. Doon nagprotesta ang GOMBURZA. Si Pelaez at ang GOMBURZA. Pero ang kondisyon ito, ang transfer mangyayari lamang pag may namatay, nag-resign, o nailipat na pare. 1865, ito nangyari masakla. Yan ang utos ng Reyna, ha? That's 1861. Nangyari 1865. Ang aming parokya sa Basilan, ang pare namatay. Ang parokya ng Shrine ng Antipolo namatay. Order na Reyna, swap. Kasi wala na. So namatay ang binigay sa amin ng Antipolo. Well, kami, binigay namin ang aming mission sa Basilan, sa mga Jesuita. Nagprotesta si Pelaez. Bakit yun ang utos ng Reyna? Wala yun sa kanon. Ang kanon na walang epekto dito. Under pa tayo ng patronato na yan, ang nag-utos niya kung sinong papalit, sinong aalis, ang Reyna ng Espanya, hindi ang Vatikano.
It's very interesting. In the middle of the 18th century, around 1750s, no, nakakatuwa that more than half of the diocesan clergy in the Archdiocese of Manila would already be Indio, Mestizo, Espanyol, and Mestizo Sangli. Okay, do you understand? Okay, Chinese Mestizo, Spanish Mestizo, and Indio. Okay, Indio. More than 50%, okay, of the diocesan clergy in the Archdiocese of Manila in the middle of the 18th century would be precisely Filipino or Mestizo. Okay, so so this will create a lot of bad blood between secular diocesan clergy and religious Spanish clergy. Okay. And Pelaez, as I said, Father Pedro Pelaez, who would act as administrator, I think, of the Archdiocese of Manila, or kind of the one in charge, because it was sede vacante, there was no archbishop at that time, would defend very strongly the rights of the secular clergy, who would now be reduced simply to the position of assistant parish priests.
In many cases, they were denied becoming parish priests, and at most they'll just become assistant parish priests.
So can you imagine that? The most educated among the Filipinos in an earlier time would in fact be these Filipino or Indio and Mestizo priests. They were the most educated. By the 19th century, of course, we will be producing people like Rizal, etc., etc. But before that, etc., it was the Filipino, okay, and therefore they were the ones now being because the Spanish colonial government were becoming afraid, because when Spain lost most of the Spanish colonies, some of the leaders of the revolutions in those Latin American colonies came from the clergy, okay? Came from the criollos, so Spaniards but born in the Americas, so they were Españoles Americanos, and therefore they were afraid that the Españoles Filipinos, that is the criollos here, full-blooded Spaniards born in the Philippines, would go the same way. Their loyalty would be to their place of birth, their country of birth, and no longer Spain, etc. So, this is the occasion for this great divide, and therefore, what started off basically, in my view, as an intra-church problem, okay, meaning to say, the conflict between secular priests and religious clergy was within the church about the assigning of parishes, the administration of parishes. No? But this will precisely and much more clearly with Jose Burgos become not just a clergy versus clergy thing, but now a Filipino versus Spanish thing. Okay?
Ngayon, makita natin the zeal and the determination of Archbishop Basilio Santa Justa, and at the same time, the argument presented by Father Pedro Pelaez na bigyan ng mas malawak na representation ang mga Pilipinong pari.
Yeah, they have started to campaign for equal rights for the clergy because they noticed that when the Jesuits returned, some of the parishes which were originally held by seculars were given back to the regulars. So, nagiging it's becoming a reason for friction between the Catholic Church.
Unfortunately, there will be a reversal of this policy. So, you have this kind of reaction thing, and this will be detrimental to the development of the native clergy in the Philippines, to the point where, in the reversal of that initial promotion of the native clergy, parishes were being taken away from them, including those parishes that they themselves had founded.
Of course, the regulars are very reluctant to give up their post. First, we started the church. Sinimulan namin yung simbahan yan. Why should we give them back to you? So, ayaw. Second, being missionaries, like the Jesuits, Dominicans, they're supposed to go back either to the convents or go to other places where there are pagans, diba? So, punta ka sa Africa, punta ka sa China. But how come those friars are still remaining in the Philippines? Ayun ang complaint. So, on the other hand, there was friction. There's also an element of money. Totoo ito. Sapagkat yung mga parokya na kung saan malakas ang kita, malakas ang contribution, pinag-aagawan niya ng mga religious orders.
The Spanish colonial government were afraid that the diocesan clergy, particularly the Filipino clergy, would become the leaders of a movement, and they were correct. Okay? This is what will happen. But then they brought it about themselves, okay? By the injustice of their system. They actually created a clergy and nationalist clergy in the Philippines that would continue even after 1872. No? Aglipay would just be one of them. Okay? And therefore, the Aglipayan schism is also to be traced terrible putting down of the native clergy in the Philippines, no? There's some clergy, but you will have, but for the most part, the Filipino clergy will in fact remain faithful to Rome, but there will be again opened up a new chapter of the history of the church under the American colonial regime.
And unfortunately, Father Pedro Pelaez died because of an earthquake that happened in Manila. So he was not able to continue his dream of giving a bigger and wider representation to the cause of the Filipino clergy. And it was continued by prominent Filipino martyrs known as Fathers Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora. More so Father Jose Burgos na sinasabing protege ni Father Pedro Pilaes. A learned man, alam niya ang lengguwahe, alam niya ang pananampalataya, and he is true to the mission na he continued the cause of the Filipino clergy.
Because the seculars were natives, they were now closer to the Indios. Let me tell you a story. Diyan sa may Cavite, sa Naik, under yan ang Dominicans. Tapos, nung pinalayas yung mga tenants sa mga sa kanilang lupain, tumakbo sila kay Father Gomez. And he managed to defend the natives. So that's one of the native clergy would be the defender of the natives. But again, why were the natives expelled? Maraming dahilan. Either hindi sila nakakabayad ng renta, that's very, very, very business-like, or maybe some better paying tenants were able to pay the rent, and therefore the old tenants had to go. Nag-complain sila kay Father Gomez. And since then, there was friction between the Dominicans and Father Gomez.
Ngayon, tingnan natin ito bilang isang spiritual nationalist movement. Pag sinabi nating spiritual nationalist movement, ito yung grupo ng mga Pilipinong pari. They do not advocate for independence. They simply advocated for reforms. Hindi porket kami mga Pilipinong pari ay we are less effective and efficient. Kasi makita naman natin na mas effective ang mga Filipino clergy. Unang-una, alam nila ang kultura ng mga Pilipino. Pangalawa, they know how to speak the language. At alam naman natin na to become an effective evangelizers, dapat alam mo ang lingwaheng ginagamit ng mga Filipino. At pangatlo, the parishioners love the Filipino clergy. I do not want to create an issue over the religious orders. Mas nakita nila yung pastoral ministry ng mga Filipino clergies over the members of the religious orders.
But the real root of the conflict is that the parishes really had to be given to the seculars, and there was resistance.
Actually, sa pag-aaral ni Michael Schumacher doon sa kanyang sinulat na Cavite Mutiny Towards a Definitive History, walang malinaw na ebidensya na nagpapatunay na ang tatlong pari, lalo na si Father Burgos, ay may direktang kinalaman doon sa pagbubuo ng revolusyon na naganap doon sa arsenal ng Cavite at sa arsenal ng Maynila. Doon sa pag-aaral, lumalabas na dalawang private citizen ang nasa likod ng sinasabing pag-atake sa dalawang arsenal na ito. It's just that nakikita ko dito that ang mga pari ay naging quote-unquote collateral damage. Maaaring ito ang maging dahilan para madamay ang kanilang pangalan at magkaroon ng mas malalim na dahilan ang Espanya para to suppress yung spiritual nationalist movement na nagaganap on the part of the Filipino clergy. And true enough, by January of 1872, ay nilitis at binigyan ng sentensyang death by strangling machine o garrote ang tatlong Pilipinong pari.
Ang sentensya kamatayan pa, bawal noon magpapatay ng pari in public. Ine-exile lang sila. Itong gobernador na to gusto public execution. Garrote pa naman. Nag-protesta ang arsobispado. RTGT, pakita mo sa akin ang kasi ang sabi ng Governor Izquierdo, Bishop, ano yan? Bago namin patayin in public, execute public yung tatlong pari, tanggalin ang kanilang susulat. Talaga, nasa ng prueba na guilty sila. Ayaw ibigay. Pero may palit na ebidensya. Ibig sabihin, kasi ang gobernador general, mason. Galit sa mga pari. At ito sa school, kasalanan ng mga braille. Kasalanan namin. Ang arsobispo naman hindi nagprotesta. Inutusan niya ng mga simbahan sa intramuros, pati mga kasama private, habang pinapatay ang mga tatlong paring inosente, ring the bell, requiem bell sa kamatayan.
They needed to curtail. When I say they needed to curtail the growing popularity of the three martyred priests, at the same time the growing popularity of the Filipino clergy, which again unfortunately led to a mistaken identity and a mistaken issue and a mistaken cause na sila ang sinisisi doon sa tinatawag natin na Cavite Mutiny.
While other priests like Father Dandan, si Pedro Dandan, he was exiled to Guam. So, ayun. Meanwhile, yung mga laymen, by the way, but the laymen, they're not concerned about the church. By the way, marami sa kanila ay mason. So, but they are fighting for reforms.
Tsaka ito, si Padre Mariano Gomez, ang kanyang profesor, Recolleto. Ang profesor. Tapos, bago siya mamatay, nag-usap yung dalawa, can you execute my last will and testament? Ang executor ng last will of testament, Recolleto. Paano mag-aaway ang mga private at yung mga diocesan priest?
Parang gumawa lang.
Ang gumawa niyan ay mga, sabi-sabi, laban sa mga private. We call it black legend.
Kung titingnan natin ang taon ng 1872 hanggang 1882, yun yung panahon ng 10 taon na katahimikan ng mga pangyayari dito sa Pilipinas. Napaka-instrumental nung execution ng 3 pari. Kasi ang naging realization dito ay humigpit, tumapang ang batas ng Espanya laban sa mga Pilipino. Kasi ang iyong isinakdal at ang iyong nilitis at ang iyong ipinapatay sa garote ay miyembro ng clergy. Tatanggalin mo na dito yung konsepto ng sila'y Pilipino, sila ay bahagi ng simbahan. And to reach a point that the Spanish authorities can do it to the members of the clergy, more so doon sa general population ng mga panahon na iyon. So it created fear among the Filipinos. Tatandaan nyo, merong unang pagsisimula. And it was started by the Filipino clergy. Kaya nga tinitingnan ito ng isang historian na si Saide na ito marahil ang isa sa malaking pagkakamali din na ginawa ng Espanya sa kanyang kolonya. At ito ay ang litisin at ipapatay ang 3 pari. At tinitingnan din ito bilang isang factor, cause, reason for the development of Filipino nationalism. Kasabay na yung pagbubukas ng Suez Canal, pagdating ng mga bagong kaalaman at kaisipan mula sa Espanya at sa Europa dito sa Pilipinas, pagkakaroon ng liberal and open-minded governor generals, paglakas nung tinatawag nating middle class at pagbubuo nung ilustrado. Eventually, the last straw was that of the execution of Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora. Kasi kung tutuloy natin yung timeline, by the year 1882, dito na papasok yung reform movement na pangungunahan ng mga ilustrados or the middle class na their education ay utang nila sa Espanya at ang kanilang edukasyon ay utang din nila sa uri ng edukasyon na nakuha nila sa Espanya.